The eyed sisters draw us into life. We wait, better, sport, sprout, chip, clasp, sunder, dwindle, die. Over us dead, they bind. He asked me about Glaucon, Aludubus, Pistolus, but where are they now? No one knew. These are some quotes from James Joyce's phenomenal novel, Ulysses, which I completed for my library book report. This is the copy that I read from my local school library. And it's really, if I could describe it in any one word, is ironic. It takes this classical tradition, which is implied in the title of the Odyssey, and puts it into the microcosm of Dublin. So it's a retelling of the Odyssey through an ironic lens, with the main character, Harold Bloom, husband of the habitually unfaithful Molly Bloom, which is one of the biggest points of irony. Whereas in the Odyssey, Odysseus comes home to find his wife has been faithful this whole time. Bloom's wife is habitually unfaithful. So it takes the whole story of the Odyssey and flips it onto and over itself. So Harold Bloom is a sort of Dublin layman. He's an everyman, and that is another point of irony. Whereas Odysseus in the Odyssey is described as somebody thrifty, somebody very very well-witted, if that works, and sort of always just, it seems in my mind when I read the or at least the Aeneid, where we get a lot of this backstory of Odysseus, it seems like he's omnipresent in every scene, no matter what ends up happening. Odysseus is always in the background. And especially in the Odyssey, we get a full view of his quick-wittedness among the sirens and the lotus eaters, and specifically the Cyclops. We see a lot of Odysseus's knowledge and his quick on his feet thinking really begin to shine through. But instead of being a hero, Harold Bloom is a Dublin regular man. He is a Jewish salesman, and he meets Stephen Daedalus, who is also paralleling from Homer, Telemachus. So the first bit of the Odyssey is Telemachus looking for his dad, and as such, the first little bit of Ulysses is also Stephen Daedalus looking for his family members, and we just sort of follow Bloom traveling, and along with Stephen Daedalus, but Bloom is our centrifugal character. It's very much so. I would say like 33% of it is Stephen Daedalus, and the rest is all Bloom. Bloom is our Odysseus, and as such, he is the one that we are following most. And whereas the Odyssey is a long, long journey representing all of human experience, Joyce condenses it into one day, into one normal, average man, to more, and this sort of draws into my larger conclusion of the book, to more accurately assess the human experience. Whereas Homer is often clouded with his heroism, of all these different characters, and everyone is great and everyone is amazing, Joyce comes along and says, and hits us with the cold water, and says, this is how it really is. Not everyone's wife is faithful, and not everybody's life is good, and not everybody is a hero, but this is the human experience. And I think that is something that really makes the novel so beautiful. So the major issues that the book is focused on, a big part of it, and a part of it why it took me so long to read and why it's very difficult to read, is its unique sense of writing. This happens a lot more in Finnegan's Wake. I have on my bookshelf over there, but and I can grab that and maybe read a little bit of it later. But it's not as bad as Finnegan's Wake, but it's very much so experimental with the way that it is written. Certain parts of it are written in prose, certain parts of it are written as a play, certain parts... I would argue that it isn't even really prosaic. It's entirely... it's difficult to compare it to other things because it's just, there's really nothing like it, other than Finnegan's Wake, and even then that is its own sort of monster. And it really, through this, explores the limits of literary irony and how far we can go. It just describes everything. It describes everything from these sort of grand Dublin bars to Harold Bloom sitting next to his wife and doing nothing. And it's such an amazing spectrum of everything that happens in one day. And it doesn't shy away from everything. In the Odyssey, it only concerns itself with the most heroic of doings. The central fugal points are things like I stated before, like the Cyclops, the Sirens, the Lotus Eaters, and those are the sort of anchors of the story. This is entirely unbound, and therefore goes wherever it wishes. And another very big theme is presenting Dublin in its pedestrian mystique. And I am aware that that is paradoxical to say, but it is entirely true. Dublin is everyday life. It is normal. It is the status quo. It is perhaps even less than what most of us are used to experiencing. It's like all these very, very dingy bars and very. It's just very like. It's difficult to explain, but it's perhaps what less of us would experience on the day-to-day is how it represents Dublin, but also more than what we would experience. It is a representation of everything. And through this sort of pedestrian setting, this sort of everyday, meaningless setting, it begins to show the foundations of the true mystique and how magical the human experience is. It does this with the rhetoric, too. Instead of describing this sort of Dublin barkeeper or old man sitting by the fire as an old man sitting by the fire, it describes him almost as a fairy tale beast, as some sort of monster with these giant teeth and these giant limbs with all this hair on his arms, and just, but in reality it's just an old man in a rocking chair. I think it really pushes the bound of rhetoric in that same sense, with that paradoxical pedestrian mystique. I absolutely love this novel. So much, if you couldn't already tell. When I was reading it, it was incredibly, incredibly difficult. But I really, really appreciate that. Just because it makes you think. It makes you think about all these different things that Joyce presents, and that through Bloom and through Daedalus and through his rhetoric, every single page begs analysis. Every single letter, every single punctuation mark just is asking and begging and pleading to be analyzed, because there is so much meaning in it. And I absolutely love that. I love being able to analyze so many different facets of a work. And it explores the boundary of what the literary tradition is as we know it. As I said before, this idea of everyone being heroic, and everything being, if not heroic, then it's tragic, and if it's not tragic, it's a comedy, and sort of all these genres that we place things into, and we can say, oh, well, I don't know, tragedy started here in the Bible, and then it evolved with some Greek tragedy, and then it evolved into Middle English, and then it evolved to here, and then maybe for some lyric poetry it started in, like, Song of Songs, and then it started, like, we can sort of, like, trace all of this on a very, like, 2D spectrum, if you will. Joyce refutes that entire notion. This is not a tragedy. This is not lyric poetry. This is not a comedy. This is not a hero's journey. This is not any of those things that we would typically define literature as today. But instead, it is all of them in one, and simultaneously nothing of them, in that it mocks every single one of them through its irony. It exists in a sort of limbo of all of these different factors. And this happens with the shift in rhetoric, as I mentioned before, and the shift in tone, and setting, and the mocking of the original myth. I mean, Homer is someone that, in the literary tradition, we definitely look up to. It's difficult not to, with such amazing works like the Odyssey, but just flipping that literary tradition on its head, I think, is a very, very, very powerful tactic, because not only are you invoking it, but you are also refuting it. And it just packs all of the human experience, for what it really is in and of itself, into one day. Because more often than not, that is human experience. It is only this moment now. Where is Homer? Where is James Joyce? Where is yesterday? Where is tomorrow? But where are you? And where is the space that you are standing in? The only real thing that we have is the present. The only real thing that we have is one day. And that is a theme that I also find very, very powerful in Ulysses. So other resources that may tie in with this book or expand its themes, obviously Homer's Odyssey is essential to reading this book. Kind of a strange thing to say, but Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, I think, adds another sort of volume of a depth, specifically in Aristotle's exploration of virtue. Okay, so we look at the root of virtue, what it means, and it comes from the Latin vir, which means man. And virtue, essentially, then, is what a man ought to be. Time and time again, examples are flooded of what a man ought to be, what a man ought to do, through the like Kantian sense of like when a man acts, he says like everybody ought to act this way. But that's another thing that Joyce sort of does away with and says that a man ought to have no obligations to anything and only experience what is here and now in one day. And then the last thing, which is a kind of pretentious thing to add, but you've made it this far, so I think you can handle it. The pretentiousness in me saying Hegel's dialectics. In that Harold Bloom acts as a sort of synthesis between everything in the world around him, between all these theses and antitheses and everything ever. Bloom develops and thrives and continues despite all of these things, and somehow he exists as a final representation, a final synthesis of all of these things. And I think that is amazing. That is just it shows the brilliance of Joyce, which can be shown so many different ways. It is just such an amazing read. I gave it a 5 in quality. I also gave it a 5 in popularity because classic literature, it's widely known. That is just all about I Have. Great book. Read it for yourself.